That afternoon in Montgomery was thick with slow heat, the kind that made everything feel like it was moving through molasses. The city carried on in its usual quiet rhythm, the kind that locals had grown used to. In the middle of Jefferson Square, sitting on the same worn wooden bench he always claimed, Otis Langston rested his hands on his knees and looked out across the plaza. His old army coat hadn't seen a dry cleaner in years, and the brim of his hat was permanently bent from sun. And yous, folks who passed by, knew him. Most just nodded, others stopped to chat, ask about his garden or his memories of the service. But on that day the peace cracked. Two officers walked across the square with that clipped pace that always made people nervous. One pointed at Otis's bench and said something about city repairs. There were no cones, no tape, nothing that looked like maintenance. Otis didn't move. He just raised his eyes and responded calmly, said he wasn't bothering anyone, but they didn't care. They put cuffs on him like it was nothing. People stared in disbelief. A woman pulled out her phone. A kid whispered, "Why him?" But Otis just closed his eyes and waited. Inside the Montgomery precinct, the air felt thick, like something unspoken had settled over the room. Sergeant Bobby Keene stood behind the desk, arms crossed, watching Otis through the glass of the holding cell. Despite his years on the force and a reputation for being by the book, something about Otis's quiet stare unsettled him. Most folks, brought in, ran their mouths or begged to be let go. Otis just sat, hands folded, calm as ever. When asked for his name, he gave it. When pressed further, he simply stated he wouldn't say more without a lawyer. The younger officers thought he was just an old man playing games, but Keene couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on. That stillness, the way Otis didn't flinch or fidget, it reminded him of the men he had served alongside years ago. Then half an hour passed. A loud screech of tires. Car. Doors slammed. 4 dark vehicles pulled up fast outside. Everyone looked up. From the first SUV stepped Victoria Mays, tall, crisp suit, eyes sharp. She held up her badge without slowing down. Inside, she barely glanced at Keene before telling him, flat out, "That man is under federal protection, and you just made a serious mistake." Inside the windowless interrogation room, everything felt too still. The hum of the overhead light was the only sound for a while. Otis sat with his arms resting quietly on the metal table, same distant expression, calm as ever, like he had all the time in the world. Across from him, Agent Victoria Mays adjusted her chair, laid a slim folder on the table, and flipped it, open with practiced control. The documents inside had markings that didn't belong in a local precinct. Red stamps, security codes, signatures crossed out, then rewritten. She slid 3 pages forward and looked Otis straight in the eye. Otis Langston, also known as Captain Shadow, part of covert Cold War operations. Officially marked as missing since 1979. Why show up now? Otis blinked slowly, then looked up from the papers. Seconds passed before he spoke. "You know what it feels like to be used and thrown away, Agent." His voice was raspy but steady. He tapped the folder lightly with 2 fingers. "I was never lost. They just stopped looking." Victoria kept her face still, but something shifted in her. He wasn't just someone who slipped through the cracks. He had been intentionally erased, and now he was done being silent. Back at the front of the station, the tension hadn't come down. Phones rang, and officers whispered, unsure if they should even be at their desks. Then the glass doors flew open again. A man in his mid-30s stormed in, jeans faded, shirt untucked, and fire behind his eyes. "Where's my grandfather?" he asked, barely holding back the edge in his voice. That was Xavier Langston. Folks in Montgomery knew him as a teacher down at Baldwin Elementary, but today he wasn't there to teach. He clutched a battered leather folder, like it was carrying more than just papers. It looked like something he'd been holding on to for a long time. When Xavier heard the FBI was involved, he demanded to see Victoria. She met him by the hallway, alert, composed. Without a word at first, he handed her the folder and said, "He told me only to use this if someone tried to shut him up." Victoria opened it carefully. Inside were photocopies of military orders, faded black and white photos, and a fragment of what clearly was a coded operations map. Sergeant Keane looked over her shoulder, took one look, and motioned to cut the room's recording system. Whatever this was, it didn't belong on official logs. In the holding room, Xavier finally met Otis's glance. The nod Otis gave him wasn't just approval, it was release. He wasn't alone anymore. While Otis sat in that small, quiet room, being questioned by federal agents, something else was brewing just outside the walls of the station. About 2 blocks away, in a corner coffee shop overlooking Jefferson Square, a law student named Danielle Rivers had captured the entire arrest on her phone. She hadn't meant to film anything serious that day. She was just trying to enjoy her break and maybe review for finals. But when she saw Otis, someone her grandmother used to call a walking piece of history, getting cuffed with no warning, her instincts kicked in and she hit record. She posted the video online with a short and blunt caption, "He was just sitting." That was all. Within a few hours, the video was everywhere. People didn't need explanations. The footage said enough. A calm, elderly man in an old military coat being pulled from a bench like he was a threat. Hashtags started trending. Posts poured in from teachers, veterans, students, and strangers from across Alabama. Crowds began showing up at the police station. They held candles, homemade signs, and questions no one could answer fast enough. The city tried to do damage control, but it was too late. Otis wasn't just a man anymore. He had become a story people refused to ignore. Later that evening, as the crowd outside the station grew and voices got louder, Xavier left quietly with Gloria Jameson, a local attorney known for standing up in cases the city usually tried to bury. She'd worked on civil rights cases for decades, and when she heard about Otis, something about the name rang a bell. She asked Xavier to walk with her back to the square, said she wanted to see the bench for herself. When they got there, evening, light stretching long across the pavement, Gloria knelt down next to the seat. She ran her hand over the slats and frowned. There were faint lines beneath the chipped brown paint, something metal pressed into the wood. She pulled a damp cloth from her purse and started gently scrubbing. Bit by bit, the outline of an old brass plaque came into view. It read, "Reserved for Otis Langston, Honor of Merit, 1972. They both just stood there for a while. The city hadn't put the bench under maintenance, and it sure wasn't random. They had painted over a memorial, wiped away the recognition of a man they now claimed they didn't know. Xavier snapped a photo, then posted it alongside an excerpt from Otis's journal. Silence wasn't an option anymore. Back at the station, long after most had gone home or walked out to join the protests, Sergeant Bobby Keane stayed behind, staring at the low hum of the desktop computer in front of him. Everything about Otis kept scratching at something inside him, a half-formed memory, or maybe just guilt he hadn't faced. He opened the old case archives to search for anything connected to the name Langston, or even just matching descriptions. Most files from the 70s were scanned in bad shape, but one report from 1974 caught his eye. An arrest during a peaceful protest downtown. The subject was unnamed in the printed report, but the photo attached was clear. Same tired eyes, same face. It was Otis. The officer listed on the arrest? Daniel Keane, Bobby's uncle, now a well-known city councilman who often gave speeches about order and tradition. Bobby leaned back, heart thudding. The report was thin. Pages missing, names blacked out with heavy ink. He dug further, requested faded boxes from storage. That's when the photo fell out. Otis in military dress, shaking hands with politicians, who were now department heads or retired in comfort. Bobby sat frozen. This wasn't just an arrest. It was history buried deep, and he was standing on top of it. Later that week, Victoria found herself on the porch of Otis's small house just outside Montgomery, where the porch sagged slightly and wind chimes clicked softly in the breeze. Otis had given her the key and told her, "If you want the full story, it's in there." The inside looked just like she imagined. Neat, quiet, and full of history no one had asked about for decades. She moved past faded family photos and shelves lined with dusty books. Tucked away in the bedroom dresser, she found a drawer packed with unopened letters in old envelopes marked with U.S. government seals. She opened them slowly. One was a formal invitation to a ceremony in Washington, dated 1982. Another asked for Otis's perspective on classified events for a potential archive project. But then came the others, letters warning him not to speak, subtle phrases like "for the safety of others" and "in service to the greater good." A few were signed by officials now quoted in textbooks. Otis stood behind her in the doorway. "Come," then he said. "I followed every order they gave, and they buried me alive for it." Victoria turned away, brushing her sleeve across her face. She had faced corrupt agents and liars before, but this was the first time she had met someone who had chosen silence, only for his country to forget him. As she left the house, she swore under her breath that she wouldn't let this stay buried, even if it meant going up against everything she thought she trusted. Back at his apartment, Xavier sat cross-legged on the floor, papers spread across every inch of the carpet. Inside the old wooden chest he'd pulled from Otis's attic was a leather-bound journal wrapped in a scarf that smelled like cedar. He hadn't opened it at first. He hesitated, like maybe some part of him wasn't ready to know everything. But once he flipped past the first few entries, he couldn't stop. Dates from the 1970s rolled by, each page filled with handwritten notes and tight sketches of missions that weren't in any textbook. There were names of leaders in Latin America, maps with no borders, and long entries about meetings in remote safe houses. But the part that shook him the most was a series describing something called Operation Mercy. Over and over, the name popped up, always followed by phrases like "never acknowledged," "scrubbed protocol," or "classified indefinitely." Xavier's chest tightened as it all sunk in, the magnitude of what Otis had done and the silence that followed. His grandfather helped stop what looked like a nuclear disaster, and no one ever spoke his name. Enough was enough. He started scanning the journal, page by page, preparing a digital file. If the truth had to bleed, it was going to bleed into the open where the world had no choice but to look. Word spread fast after the mayor's office announced a public event to honor Otis Langston. Local news called it a ceremony of acknowledgement, though nobody quite used the word apology. Still, the pressure had reached a boiling point, and the city needed to show it was doing something. When Otis received the invitation, he didn't answer right away. He sat with it for a full day, watching the news on mute and flipping a coin without looking at it. Finally, he agreed, but on one condition: he would speak. His words, his way. No edits, no approvals. That didn't go over well at City Hall. The mayor's team tried to negotiate, offering a joint statement instead, but people were tired of scripted moments. Gloria didn't waste time backing Otis. At a press conference, she said loud and clear, "A man who risked his life can risk his words too." Soon after, Xavier helped form a volunteer group to stand with Otis, a quiet line of protection in case the ugly side of town showed up. Victoria, noticing things getting tense, pushed through a security protocol reserved for high-threat cases, but through it all, Otis never flinched. If they gave him a microphone, he was going to tell the truth. In the week leading up to the event, Otis didn't rest much. Not because of nerves, but because he had a mission. Instead of staying home preparing a speech, he spent his time visiting people he hadn't seen in decades. Folks who, like him, had been left behind by medals, parades, and politics. There was Leonard, now blind, selling scratch tickets outside a gas station on Highway 31. Then James, who hadn't stepped outside his room in years, stuck in a wheelchair with family long gone. And Ruth, who still wore her brother's army photo in a pendant around her neck, even though the government never sent her a letter. Otis sat with each one, listened more than he talked, and made a simple request. "Would you speak beside me?" They agreed. All of them. The city adjusted the ceremony. 19 voices would be heard, each given 3 minutes. Gloria coordinated everything, while Xavier helped arrange transport and seating for them all. Victoria quietly checked for threats and made sure backup patrols would be nearby. Meanwhile, reporters caught wind of the list of names and stories and started gathering, like birds before a storm. When the morning came, one thing was certain: the silence of the past wasn't going to survive the day. The sun was already high when the crowd gathered in front of the old courthouse in Birmingham. Rows of chairs had been set under a wide tent, and state flags flapped lightly in the breeze. People whispered, adjusted their phones, and tried to spot familiar faces. News vans lined the far sidewalk, their satellite dishes pointed toward the sky. At the center of it all stood a wooden stage, wide enough for 24 chairs, a podium, and far too many cameras. When the speaker lineup began, one by one the veterans stepped up. Each shared something, a memory, a loss, or just a name that had never been spoken out loud in this kind of space. 19 voices, 3 minutes each. Then Otis took the last step onto the stage. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the printed speech the state had given him. Without saying a word, he tore it slowly down the center, then in half again, and let the pieces fall. From his back pocket he took out the old journal, the one Xavier had helped preserve. He read quietly, a passage about enemy fire, the ache of returning home, and how a man could feel invisible in his own country. "They say they didn't forget me," Otis said, voice steady. "Maybe, but they sure forgot my brothers." No one spoke, not the governor, not the mayor, not even the crowd. Otis didn't smile or cry. He just nodded once and stepped down with Bobby on one side, Xavier on the other. It wasn't a celebration. It was something colder, a late debt returned on public record. A few weeks after the ceremony, Victoria was digging through digitized files in the Federal Archives late one night, nursing cold coffee and clicking through records from the early 80s. That was when she noticed something strange, a scanned document dated June of 1981, marked "Draft Not Submitted." It was a formal request for a presidential pardon addressed to the White House, signed by Otis himself. It cited classified missions and unnamed operations, most likely connected to what they now knew as Operation Mercy. Below that were handwritten notes from a junior officer flagging it for review, but no signs anyone had followed through. Frustrated and moved, Victoria made an official submission using today's process and added a detailed report, including testimony and historical findings. When a reply came weeks later, it was short. 2 paragraphs that boiled down to this: insufficient records. Recognition denied. The team sat in silence as she read it aloud. Gloria shook her head, fuming. Xavier didn't say anything, just kept typing. The story, however, was already moving faster than any agency could stop. Op-eds filled weekend papers. Professors offered to help document the mission. When Victoria told Otis about the decision, he just chuckled. "They still think paper cuts hurt me," he said. "Let 'em try. They're too late." The momentum didn't slow. Following a packed town hall meeting at the Montgomery Civic Center, led by Gloria and Xavier, residents poured in to vote on a proposal that felt long overdue. After just over 2 hours of discussion, with comments from teachers, veterans, high schoolers, and even church leaders, it passed without much pushback. By majority vote, June would officially become Invisible Honor Month, marking a future where the overlooked wouldn't stay hidden. The city got to work right away. Local artists painted murals across downtown walls, each one carrying stories of quiet bravery. High schools hosted writing workshops where kids interviewed veterans and turned their testimonies into poems. On signs and maps, the courthouse square received a new name, Langston Square, cementing something real in the city's daily life. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Otis agreed to serve as the first honorary ambassador for the month, though he only went to events if the others came with him. People cheered when they saw him, but he never stood too far from Ruth, Leonard, or James. "Don't give me statues," he liked to say. "Give me ladders for the folks still in the dark." And every time he showed up, that's exactly what he did.